We're here for chapter 8 about memory. This chapter is kind of short, and I'm going to try and go nice and quick because I think I said that about the last chapter and then I went really long. I apologize. Let's get started. There are 3 stages of memory: encoding, storing, and retrieving. Encoding is transforming the information into a form that can be stored into memory. Then we store it, which involves maintaining the encoded information in memory. And finally, when we need it, we retrieve it, reaccessing the information from the past, which has been encoded and stored. This is memory. When you're encoding, let's talk about the encoding stage. We have something called automatic processing, which is effortless and includes space, time, frequency, things that get encoded into your memory without even thinking about it. And then we have effortful processing, which is effortful. We do think about it. We study or memorize. We learn things purposefully. That's effortful processing. There are 3 different types of encoding that we do related to our different senses, sort of. There's semantic encoding, which is word meaning, and this is the strongest type of encoding. Then there's visual encoding, which is encoding images, and acoustic encoding, which involves encoding sounds. And between images, sounds, and word meaning, we can encode all the stuff around us into our storage. However, there's there's one more thing I want to point out is the self-reference effect. The self-reference effect is that people tend to have a better memory for information that relates to themselves. So if you're trying to learn something or memorize something that doesn't relate to you, make it relate to you. Find a connection. It'll be easier to remember it. All right, moving on from encoding to storage. How does storage happen? Well, storage is the creation of a permanent record of information. Storage is the process of moving the information from our sensory memory to our short-term memory and then to our long-term memory. So let's talk about each step along the way. The first step is sensory memory, which is very brief, just for a couple of seconds. The information from our senses is stored there, and everything that we don't think is valuable is discarded, and something we do think is valuable will move into the short-term memory. So the sensory memory sort of weeds out what we need to remember and what we don't. Everything we don't goes in the trash. Everything we do need to remember goes into our short-term memory. The short-term memory is a temporary storage system that processes the incoming sensory memory, like I just said. And the short-term memory lasts just 15 to 30 seconds. That's it. So you only have 15 to 30 seconds with the stuff in your short-term memory, at which point it either is lost, you can rehearse it to keep it in your short-term memory, or you can load it into your long-term memory forever. So active rehearsal, there's different types of rehearsal. Rehearsal can keep things in your short-term memory, or it can also move things into your long-term memory. Active rehearsal is when you repeat or practice the information. Doing this keeps it in your short-term memory longer, and it encodes it into your long-term memory. It files it away into your long-term memory. So if you need to remember a phone number, you can just repeat it over and over and over. Or if you need to memorize a poem or a speech, you keep repeating it over and over and over until it's ingrained in your long-term memory. Elaborative rehearsal, on the other hand, is where you need to make connections and create meaning or give examples to remember something. So there are 2 ways to remember something. One would be active rehearsal, to practice and repeat. And the second would be elaborative rehearsal, where you make connections in your mind, connect it to your life or something you already know, give it meaning, give it examples. It'll help you remember it. And rehearsing moves this information to our long-term memory. The 2 types of rehearsal move it into our long-term memory. And long-term memory is defined as the continuous storage of information. The capacity is believed to be unlimited. It encompasses all the things you can remember that happened more than just a few minutes ago. Everything that didn't just happen is in your long-term memory, all of it. But there are lots of different types of long-term memory. Let's break it down. There's explicit and implicit. Explicit memory, also known as declarative memory, are things that you can tell somebody you know, things that you can say. I know this math concept. I know the definition of this word. And in fact, explicit memory or declarative memory can be broken down even more into episodic and semantic memories. Episodic are related to events or experiences, whereas semantic is related to concepts and facts. Both are declarative memory, meaning you can say it, you can talk about it, right? You can say, I remember last year when I went to Disneyland, we stood in line for over 2 hours and I was so hot. That's your episodic memory. Semantic memory is to say, I know that the definition of study is to, or whatever, right? I don't need to give you all my examples, but semantic is the concepts and facts. I promised I was going to be fast. I'm sorry. Implicit memory is the opposite of explicit memory. We don't know that we have it. It's just our memory either to how to do things, procedural memory, our memories of being exposed to previous stimuli, which is priming memory, or the emotional conditioning that goes on during classical conditioning. This is our memory too. Remember, little Albert became scared of the rat because of the loud noise. He doesn't necessarily specifically remember, oh, when I saw the rat, I heard a loud noise and then I got scared. But he has that memory in his mind, rat, scary. Rat makes me cry. That's his emotional conditioning, implicit memory. Moving on nice and quick. Our last step of memory is retrieval. How do we do? What is retrieval? The act of getting information out of the memory storage and back into conscious awareness. We just talked about how we encode it and how we store it. Now it's time to retrieve it. There's three types of retrieval. There's straight up recall, remembering information without any cues. I ask you a question. What is the formula for the area of a rectangle? And you tell me, I remember length times width. You remembered without any cues. Recognition is identifying with a cue. So picking somebody out of a lineup, for example, or a multiple choice test, or remembering somebody's name once you see their picture. You have the cue and you're just recognizing the person or the right answer or the right shape. I could ask you, what is an octagon? And you would use recall to tell me it's a polygon, a closed figure with 8 sides, looks like a stop sign. Or you could use recognition to pick an octagon out of a sheet of different shapes. That would be recognition. The third type of retrieval is relearning. This tells us that even after a long break, it's easier to learn something a second time. So if you feel like you've forgotten something, if you haven't spoken Spanish in 20 years, you can relearn it faster than you learned it the first time. In the picture example, these patients are learning to walk again. They already knew how to walk before their accident or their stroke or whatever issue they have. They're learning it again. It'll be easier the second time because they've already learned it before. So now that we know our steps of memory and how memory happens, where does it happen? Well, it happens in the amygdala, the hippocampus, the cerebellum, and the prefrontal cortex. You don't really need to know which part happens in which part of the brain, so don't worry too much about that. Just know that the amygdala is related to our emotions, so that helps with the emotional side of memory. The other stuff's not all that important, what goes where, especially because the scientists aren't even 100% sure what happens where. But I do want you to understand arousal theory, which is interesting. Arousal theory tells us that strong emotional experiences can trigger the release of neurotransmitters and hormones which strengthen our memory. Therefore, our memory for an emotional event is better than our memory for a non-emotional event, usually. So I think that sort of makes sense. It's sort of common knowledge that you remember emotional events better than non-emotional events. Whether it was a good, happy event or a scary event or a sad event, events that are highly emotional stick out more in our memory. And the reason for that is that these emotional experiences trigger neurotransmitters and hormones, which actually chemically strengthen our memory storage process. So I think that's kind of cool, arousal theory. Something else I find very interesting, I know I always say that, amnesia. I think most people find amnesia interesting. My kids and I just watched 50 First Dates the other day. Amnesia is the loss of long-term memory that occurs as the result of either disease, physical trauma, or psychological trauma. 3 different reasons for amnesia. This is important. There are 3 different reasons for amnesia. They can be a disease, a physical trauma like an accident, or psychological trauma. It does not have to be a physical thing to affect your memory and cause amnesia. There are 2 types of amnesia: anterograde amnesia, where you can't remember new things, and retrograde amnesia, where you can't remember what happened before the trauma or the accident or the disease. So anterograde amnesia, you cannot remember new information, although they can remember information and events that happened prior to the injury. Usually in this case, it's the hippocampus that is affected. And many people with this form of amnesia are unable to form new episodic or semantic memories. However, they can still form new procedural memories. So it's kind of like they don't learning anything new, but they can learn new procedures. They can learn how to solve a new puzzle or do a new physical skill, but they can't learn new definitions or remember new things that happened to them. 2 examples of people with anterograde amnesia are HM and KC over here on the side. In the literature, they're always referred to by their initials, but they do have names, Henry and Kent. HM, Henry Molaison, had part of his hippocampus removed because he had epilepsy. And KC, Kent Cochran, was in an accident, but both of them suffered from amnesia, and because of their injuries, we were able to learn a lot about the brain and memory and amnesia. So, while it is very sad what happened to these men, they can be proud that they really contributed a lot to the science of memory and studying the brain and how memory works in the brain. So that's cool. And as I said, retrograde amnesia is the loss of memory for events that occurred prior to the trauma, before the trauma. People with retrograde amnesia cannot remember some or even all of their past. They have specific difficulty remembering episodic memories. They don't remember anything that happened to them before. They usually remember things like the names for words or how to do certain things. It's the episodic memories, things that happened to them that they can't remember. All right, on from amnesia to false memories. False memories are very different than amnesia. They are memories that you think are real and they feel real, but they're not. Sometimes just the details are not real. Sometimes the whole entire memory is not real. Suggestibility are the effects of misinformation from external sources that leads to the creation of false memories. So suggestibility is what causes false memories. The misinformation effect paradigm tells us that after exposure to additional and possibly inaccurate information, a person may misremember an original event. And then false memory syndrome is the recall of false autobiographical facts, things you remember false about your own past. False memories are very, very common, and they can cause lots of issues. In an interesting study over here on the left, people in the study were told about a car accident, and then they were asked and I believe they were showed a video of the car accident, and then they were told about it. And they were asked to guess how fast the cars were going. And they found that if the researcher used the word smashed, people perceived the speed to be a lot higher than if he used the word bumped or hit. And if he just said contacted, the subjects perceived the speed as much slower. So the words used was the suggestibility, or the not misinformation, but the suggestibility that was priming the subjects to thinking that it was going to be fast or medium or slow. And then over on the right side, this graph is important and quite sad when you think about it. These were the first 239 people exonerated once DNA evidence became a thing. So science for DNA evidence only came out, I believe, in the 80s. And before that, there was no such thing as DNA evidence in a crime. Lots of people who were wrongfully convicted, who were innocent and put into jail, were let free once the DNA science came to be, and we were able to test the DNA from the crime and find out that they did not, in fact, do it. All of this to say that there was a study that looked at why they were wrongfully convicted. What was it that put them behind bars when they did not even do anything wrong? And the number one cause of wrongful conviction was eyewitness misidentification. So eyewitnesses picking somebody out of a lineup or describing somebody or answering questions about their eyewitness account, and they're wrong. Eyewitness accounts are often wrong. I've read some statistics saying they're almost always wrong. Eyewitness accounts can really be wrong a lot of the time, and when picking the wrong person out of a lineup results in them spending their entire life in jail, I think it's very important that we look into how wrong eyewitness identifications can be and eyewitness accounts can be. There are some very interesting and sad stories in the textbook about wrongful convictions. Make sure you read those ones. We're almost done with this chapter, I promise. Let's talk about forgetting. Forgetting is the loss of information from your long-term memory. You put it in there, you remember it, and one day you forget it. Why do we forget? There are three main reasons why people forget things or they, lose them from their long-term memory. One is transience. Unused memories fade with the passage of time. This is the most common reason to forget things, and as you can see in the graph, the longer the time since learning, the less you remember. Absent-mindedness is another reason for forgetting. This is just lapses in memory caused by breaks in attention or focusing on something else. This would be like when you forget where you leave your phone. That's absent-mindedness. You just I like to call it forgetting to pay attention. I forget to pay attention, or I forget to remember. Blocking is not what it sounds like. You're not blocking it on purpose. It's when something is on the tip of your tongue and you just can't get to it. It's like there's something physically blocking it. And researchers don't quite understand why this happens. And then there's two types of interference that can lead to forgetting. One is proactive interference, where old information hinders the recall of new information. So maybe I've memorized my old bank account number, makes it hard for me to memorize my new bank account number. Retroactive interference, on the other hand, is when the new information hinders the recall of older information. Maybe I forget my social security number because I just memorized a new phone number. This has actually happened to me before. I remember when I memorized my kids' healthcare numbers, their Kaiser numbers, I totally forgot mine, and I was on the phone with the lady one day going crazy. I couldn't remember my own healthcare number that I'd known for so long because I had memorized my kids' numbers. That's retroactive interference. So this slide here just talks about the three that I already mentioned. Transience, where you forget things over time. Absent-mindedness, where you forget because of a lapse of attention. And blocking, where you forget it's just on the tip of your tongue. We don't know why that information is temporarily blocked, and it's so annoying when you can't think of that word or that name. That's blocking. There are some other issues with memory too that aren't necessarily forgetting. It's more about distortion or intrusion. There's misattribution, which is where the source of your memory is confused. So maybe you think that something that was a dream happened when you were awake, or you think one person told you something when somebody else told you something. Obviously, this can be a problem. If I think that it was my professor who told me something and it was really my toddler who told me that could be a problem. Suggestibility is another type of distortion which we talked about earlier. It creates false memories. And it can, for example, result from leading questions, which often happens in court situations. Bias is another type of distortion where your memories are distorted by your belief system, right? So if you already have a system in place, right? Maybe you already think, oh, teenagers are crazy drivers, and then you have a fender bender and you assume that the person was driving more erratically once you see that they're a teenager. This would be bias, memory bias. And finally, persistence is kind of the opposite of forgetting. It's intrusion, where you cannot stop something or you can't forget an undesirable memory, something traumatic, something in that bothered you in the past, or even an annoying song. I'll be a little bit mean right now and tell you, Baby Shark, doo 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 doo. And then that's probably going to be in your head for a while. Baby Shark can be very intrusive. That's persistence when it won't go away. I think this is our last slide before our summary. Memory enhancing strategies, how to make your memory better. You can chunk things into manageable chunks or bits. You can do that elaborative rehearsal that we talked about earlier, where you think about the meaning of the new information, relate it to things, think of examples, relate it to yourself. And you can use a mnemonic device, which is a memory aid to help organize the information for encoding. Things like acronyms like Roy G. Biv to remember the colors of the rainbow, or rhymes or acrostics or images, whatever it takes to help you remember something. All right, let's do our summary. Memory is the set of processes used to encode, store, and retrieve information over different periods of time. Automatic processing is effortless and includes space, time, and frequency. Effortful processing, on the other hand, is when you're purposefully memorizing or learning something. You're studying, memorizing, you're learning it on purpose. Semantic encoding involves encoding word meanings, and it's the strongest type of encoding. Visual encoding involves encoding images, and acoustic encoding involves encoding sounds. Your sensory memory is the first stage of memory. It's very brief storage, just a couple seconds. It throws out everything you don't need and sends the important stuff to your short-term memory, which is a temporary storage system that processes incoming sensory memories. This only lasts 15 to 30 seconds in your short-term memory, longer if you rehearse. Active rehearsal is repeating or practicing information till you store it into your long-term memory. Elaborative rehearsal is making connections with the new information, creating meaning or giving examples, personal connections, until it's stored in your long-term memory. Long-term memory is the continuous storage of information. The capacity is believed to be unlimited. We can store as much as we want in our long-term memory, and it involves all the things you can remember that happened more than just a few minutes ago, including explicit memories, which we consciously try to remember and recall, also called declarative memory. Explicit memories involve episodic memory and semantic memory. Episodic is information about events we've personally experienced, whereas semantic memory is about words, concepts, and language-based knowledge. As opposed to explicit memory, we also have implicit memory, memories that are not part of our consciousness. We don't know that we are learning it. Procedural memory is a type of long-term memory for skilled actions, such as how to swim or ride a bike or open a can. Priming is when stimulus exposure affects responses to later stimulus. That's still a type of memory, even though we don't realize it's there. And our emotional conditioning, classical conditioned emotional responses. We also don't know they're there, but that memory is there in our implicit memory. The last step of memory is retrieval. When we need the information, we get it out of our long-term storage and pull it back into our conscious awareness. There's recall, which is when you remember information without any cues. Recognition, when you identify with a cue. And relearning, which is when it's easier to learn something for a second time. Over to the right-hand side, arousal theory tells us that our memory for an emotional event is better than our memory for a non-emotional event. You'll remember that this is because emotions set off neurotransmitters and hormones which improve memory. Amnesia is the loss of long-term memory. It occurs as a result of disease, physical trauma, or psychological trauma. Anterograde amnesia is the loss of memory for events that occur after the brain trauma. And retrograde amnesia is the opposite. That's when you cannot remember events that occurred prior to the brain trauma, before it. Suggestibility is the effects of misinformation from external sources that lead to the creation of false memories. Misinformation effect paradigm tells us that after exposure to additional inaccurate information, a person may misremember an original event. This can definitely lead to problems with eyewitness accounts and people being put in prison for no reason. False memory syndrome is the recall of false autobiographical facts, things about yourself. The book does a pretty good job of explaining the issues with this and how it's often it's really hard to know if false memory syndrome is happening or not. Forgetting is the loss of information from our long-term memory, which can happen by transience, where unused memories fade with the passage of time. Forgetting can also happen with absent-mindedness, lapses in memories caused by breaks in attention or focus. And forgetting can happen with blocking. That's a temporary block of stored information when it's on the tip of your tongue. Proactive interference can affect memory as well. That's where old information hinders the recall of new information. And the opposite, retroactive interference, where information learned more recently hinders the recall of older information. Something I learn now makes me forget something I used to know. And some tips to increase your memory abilities. Chunking is organizing information into manageable bits or chunks. Elaborative rehearsal is thinking about the meaning of our new information in relation to things we already know. And mnemonic devices are memory aids or tricks, songs or rhymes or acronyms that help you organize information for encoding. The book right at the end has some tips for studying. I think those are worth reading. They're quite useful.